Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you're all sufficiently fed and watered and ready for the afternoon programme. My name is Joe Guy. I'm the Vice President for Theory, Research and Policy at the Democracy Collaborative in Washington, D.C. I'm also the Executive Director of the Next System Project. You'll be hearing some of my thoughts on the next panel, but I'm going to be chairing this panel for this session, which is Frontiers of Radical Local Government, Institutions and Policies. Our first presenter will actually be a double act. They'll be dividing the time between them. Keir Milburn of the University of Leicester and Bertie of the University of Sheffield. Next up, we will have Satoko Kishimoto of the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam, who's been doing interesting work on remunicipalization. Next will be my colleague Dan Hind, who's a fellow with the Next System Project, but also a renowned expert on democracy and media. Then we'll have Carys of IPPR and also of Shared Assets. Carys edits IPPR Progressive Review, among other things. And then last up will be Simon Parker of the University of York. So without further ado, let's get straight into it. Gentlemen, 10 minutes.
Hello everyone, I'm Bert.
And I'm Keir.
And we're your double act for the afternoon session. So what we're going to do, we've chosen this format for a very specific reason, which was, I'm sure like all of you, you've read Joe and Martin's piece that was in Renewal earlier last year, called The Institutional Turn. And Keir and I both read that and immediately called each other and broke it down and thought, this is really fascinating, we agree with what's in here, it's going to push us forward, but we wanted to pick up on a few elements of it, and we kept going to and forth. We had to sit around 12 hours worth of phone calls that came from that, and we thought we'll just come and deliver that 12 hours worth of phone calls in 10 minutes, which is fine.
But it turned into an article which was published in Renewal, in the latest issue of Renewal. So you can get it there.
Yeah. So if any of this comes out garbled, you don't quite pick up on it, don't worry, we've written that phone call down in long form.
We will be releasing this full 12 hours of the phone call of the podcast, but later.
For record.
Yeah.
So why were we excited about this piece? We think that the piece was really right in arguing that this new institutional approach is an essential component in our shift towards developing a new socialism. And also what that new socialism means and where institutions fit with that as some form of transitional stage, as a tactic, as a strategy. Coming to highlight and pick up some other work around that area as well that we read or inspired, I know inspired you guys as well. Like Thomas Hanna's recent book that came out, which is Our Commonwealth, which is focused on the US but draws on a number of other places. Andrew Cumber's earlier work, Reclaiming Public Ownership, really inspiring text and inspiring thinking in terms of the place of infrastructure and institutions in a broader project of socialist transformation. The key element for us that stood out in this and that really came through in our phone call was why exactly does this new institutionalism, why does this fit within something we could call a socialist strategy? But what's the connection here between remunicipalising energy companies or redirecting public spending or taking innovative approaches to procurement? Why does this actually fit within something that we would call a socialist strategy as opposed to a new form of reinvigorated social democracy in some way? And this is really what underpinned our conversation and how we took it forward. And perhaps paradoxically, we thought, let's return to Margaret Thatcher with the question of socialism. Now there was a logic behind this, especially when we're talking about institutions. What came through was that the last great institutional turn was pioneered or began with Thatcher, and it was a key part of the neoliberal political project as a strategy of social change, which is important to how we're approaching this and thinking about this. Now we're not saying it was just Thatcher, but it certainly began with Thatcher, or certainly rolled out with Thatcher, beginning with Thatcher. And we went back to an interview she gave in 1981, which we think she kind of let slip a little bit of where that strategy was going. And at the end of this interview in the Times, she said that economics are only the method. The objective is to change the heart and soul. And And we thought that was quite interesting language or ideas to be associated with what is normally quite dry ideas of institutions and institutional management. And for us, we thought it's really digging into that that's absolutely central to understanding where this new institutionalism will fit within something that we could call a socialist project, and obviously taking that forward into this debate about where we move forward with Labour as well. So we saw that the way that a lot of people really focused on neoliberalism, and these are using Jamie Peck's words, who's a geographer, and this was a paper that was written back in 2002, I think. A lot of people really focus in on neoliberalism as being something which is the rolling back of the state. Conventionally, we think of cutting funding, deregulation, which fits into this as well, the stripping down of local institutions, depopulating it, and the transferring of services into the private sector. So none of that's going to sound new to you in any way. But we saw that this rolling back of the state has only ever been one part of the method of neoliberalism as a change strategy, as a social change strategy. And actually we also need to focus on what Jamie Peck termed rolling out of neoliberalism. We saw that is central to understanding this project of changing the heart and soul, and to think about what it is that neoliberalism is really trying to achieve. Now, in particular, we wanted to focus on that point as well, because the Alternative Models of Ownership report, which came out, which is inspiring, sets all a challenge in terms of where we move forward, only use ownership in the title. And if there's one lesson we can absolutely take from that neoliberal project, is that challenging ownership has only ever been one part of the strategy. Governance in there, and what that governance does, is an essential component of it in terms of how we move forward. In fact, governance, along with ownership, is the method for changing heart and soul. So if we want to ask where does this institutionalism fit, we maybe have to return to asking how do we actually use it to try and channel and attack and move and shape the heart and the soul.
Yeah, so if institutional reform is going to be a central part of this new socialism, which is basically the argument, or one of the arguments of Joe Martin's paper or article, then what we thought was, well, let's think about what the institutional reforms that neoliberalism has undertaken. It presented a couple of questions for us. The first question is, what has neoliberalism done to institutions? Right? But the second question then is, what did institutional reform do for neoliberals? What were they trying to achieve through their institutional reform? There's lots of different ways you can get into that, right? There's a whole body of theory which argues that neoliberalism, the neoliberal project, can be defined by institutional reform. The Birth of Biopolitics lectures by Foucault, very important for that whole series of other books. So we could go into a sort of like exegetical analysis, but I don't think that's appropriate now. So instead I'm going to talk about reality TV. I think reality TV can provide a sort of an analogy for neoliberal institutional reform. I'd actually argue it's not just an analogy. It's part of what I'm analogizing, I would say. If you remember back to the birth of reality TV, there wasn't a competitive element in original reality TV. It was more, you'd take a group of people who didn't know each other, you'd put them in an unusual environment, you'd film the results, and then you'd produce a dramatic narrative out of that. Right? Obviously, the dramatic narrative concentrated on the moments of conflict. So around the early 2000s, reality TV, the genre of reality TV was reformed in order to add a competitive element. So with Big Brother and then The Apprentice, a competitive voting out element was introduced. Right? And that's why people watch them now. Right? I imagine when people watch The Apprentice, I try not to watch it. They don't watch it for a group of people incompetently trying to fulfill a series of tasks. You watch it for the boardroom scene, in which people turn on each other, stab each other in the back, and behave in a broadly sociopathic manner. So we can think of reality TV was reformed in order to provoke or to induce a certain form of behaviour. And the formats of those TV shows are tweaked every series. They're constantly tweaked in order to make sure that sort of backstabbing, competitive, borderline sociopathic behaviour, that's the form of behaviour that predominates. Right? I think neoliberal institutional reform follows a broadly similar model, right? That's the point of introducing competitive markets into institutions. when we are forced to engage with a competitive market, and so one of the, or a pseudo-competitive market, so one of those would be, I'm an academic, the ref, or the TEF, right? I'm forced to engage with this, and when I'm forced to engage with this, I'm forced to behave in a certain manner, or else what I do will not be valued, right? So a certain sort of behaviour is being induced by valuing certain outcomes and disvaluing other outcomes. Basically, the sort of behaviour we're being promoted to adopt is a sort of self-promoting, competitive, often selfish type of behaviour, which cuts ourselves off from cooperative relations with other people in our institutions at the very least. And in fact, institutional reform in local government, the introduction of pseudo-competitive markets into hospitals, etc. We could also add, our forced engagement with relations of debt, which operate in a similar sort of way, which were assessed, by our ability to our past behaviour and our ability to fulfil future debt obligations. All of those carry an institutional logic, and they're more or less the same institutional logic. It's this process of repetition of continually engaging with institutions which are inducing a certain form of behaviour, which means that we come to anticipate the sort of behaviour that we know are going to be valued. And by continually engaging with them, anticipating them, we come to adopt those behaviours without thinking about it. And it comes to present a sort of, almost a sort of common sense upon which our view of the world is based. Our argument is this, right? Any contemporary left project will have to start from the reality that people's subjectivities, the way they think and understand themselves, their relationships with other people and their relationships with the world. Any transformative left project will have to start by undoing that process of subjective training that's been taking place by neoliberal institutional reform. But we want to go one further. We say, actually, any transformative left project has to produce its own institutional logic, a logic and direction in which our own institutional reform will go.
So that was the first 6 hours of our phone call. And when we developed this and we submitted this as our kind of response, as our response to renewal, and quite rightly, we were asked the question, what on earth do you mean by commons again? But in a slightly more polite way. Yeah, but that's what I am. Yeah. So what do you mean by commons? You're talking about common sense here, we're using this language, and it's come up quite today as well, which is why it's good that we were asked on this. If you're pushing towards the idea of commons and different forms of institutions, common institutions, as a response to this, as a way to take this pathway of producing a new type of common sense, you need to justify what you mean by commons. So, like all good academics, we quote somebody else. But not academics, a peer-to-peer foundation, which if you've not come across them, I strongly recommend that you search them out. And they know that commons are neither the resource, the community that gathers around it, nor the protocols for its stewardship, but the dynamic interaction between all of these elements. Taken together, these elements also contribute to the emergence of the paradigm shift that see commons and the act of commoning as a worldview, which for us, we call this new everyday common sense. So we can see, it's important to come back to some of those early contributions. We're not just talking about, how do we govern that field better? That in itself is not a common, so we don't just talk about code as a commons. It's about all of the relationships, the sets of rules that we use in terms of how we engage with it, and whatever that thing is as well. It's all of those put together, plus the new logic of how we engage with one another, and the cultural shift that takes place with that. And crucial to this was that this cultural shift, this new common sense, this idea of somebody, a person that's fit for a post-capitalist society, doesn't just come about naturally. This goes back to, I think, a little discussion that started earlier. Is it all within us and it just needs to be set free? We're saying we need to produce the type of people that we want in our future utopian society together. This common sense doesn't happen spontaneously, but it has to be produced. It's an outcome. It was an outcome as part of the political project and has been for 40 years. And we need to produce a different outcome as part of our political project. And one of the ways we think we can do this is through the production of public common partnerships, which Satoko has actually been touched on a little bit, possibly, within some of her presentation. I'm going to give one really quick example of what we mean by that, and then Keir's going to quickly give you an idea of what it means to scale that up and where that fits within this idea. So the town of Wolfhagen in Germany, it's got around 12,000 to 14,000 people that live there. In 2012, they developed a new form of cooperative participation. They have now got 100% green energy production, and the cooperative that was formed, which is energy users, citizens and workers, sits on the board of the actual energy company, which is a municipal energy company. At the same time, people from the board of the energy company sit on the board of the cooperative. Dividends from this cooperative, dividends from the energy company go into the cooperative, which are then ring-fenced for a green energy fund. That green energy fund then can be spent on municipal improvements, and that can be anything from channeling that back into new infrastructure, or it can be used to subsidise the cost of washing machines, which makes it easier for people to upgrade the technology in their houses, and so on and so on. The point being within this particular case is that it's radically changing the idea of who makes decisions, when, how they make decisions, what their day-to-day experience looks like, and challenging the idea that it is the state which is the only place democracy happens. In fact, it's saying democracy happens whenever people have a stake in making decisions together. The political challenge that we're putting forward is that we need to expand outwards and push power outwards from institutions to new places, new institutions, from state outwards from state. New places where people get the opportunity to learn and to practice democracy.
So we're arguing that the commons should be the direction of travel through which institutional reform is going. We're not arguing that we can common the whole of the economy tomorrow. Right? It's an iterative process, but that this provides a direction, a logic, an institutional logic for reform. We found this in a 1991 government white paper called Competing for Quality. There's this little quote which sort of sums up the neoliberal institutional logic. Right? It says, privatise if market solutions are better, but if not, introduce market mechanisms as much as possible to increase consumer control over service. Let's leave that control over service. We've seen that that's defunct, but you can see what the direction of travel. I mean, we'd want to reverse engineer that and say, you know, produce commons wherever the conditions for commons exist. If they don't exist, democratise to produce the conditions for commoning further down the road. So it gives a sort of direction for travel, a direction for travel which goes slightly beyond just democratising. So we'd argue something like this. You know, the commons and the common sector and the collaborative sector would act as democratic anchor institutions, and it would anchor the whole process of democratising society, which is basically the direction we'd like to go. I mean, so in between that institutional logic, we could see a whole series of steps that we'd like to take. You know, one of the things we're interested in is thinking about drawing up commons transition plans on a municipal level. There was one drawn up for the city of Ghent in Belgium. So we think that would be an interesting way in which you could start to put this into practice on a municipal level. And then we want to look at opportunities to develop public commons partnerships. There's a market project, I can't see where Ben is now. There's a market project in Tottenham where we're sort of trying to develop this idea and say, can we turn this into a public commons partnership, this redevelopment of a market which is going to get abolished in order to build luxury housing. And so public commons partnerships for us, they sort of epitomise this institutional logic, and I think they epitomise this an in and against the state strategy on a municipal level, which somebody mentioned a little bit earlier. Right? Move from the public towards the commons whenever possible. You got that?
Yeah. Chaz and David socialism.
Thank you very much. And if you want to read that article by Keir and Bertie, or indeed the original piece by Martin and myself, they're freely available on the Renewal website, which is renewal.org.uk. Satoko?
Find them if you look at the Twitter hashtag local justice. I put the links up.
Fantastic. Yeah, sure. Get you up. Get your mic.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Joe. Sorry, I feel a little bit more relaxed to be here. Oh, that looked really tough. Thank you, Joe. Okay, thank you very much for the Martin, and particularly organizing this amazing, important conference, and for having me here. In 10 minutes, I'm going to focus on the re-municipalization as a kind of as a strategy of radical municipalist movement. So I want to share with you some the research findings, but also I want to share with you a bit of future planning, how we want to advance this research, which is very, very collectively done with many organizations. I'm from Transnational Institute based in Amsterdam. So I'm working with here Wainwright over there and in the project called Public Alternatives in the program of economic justice. So in this framework, last, let's say, many years, but more than 10 years, I'm mainly working on the water privatization struggles, supporting the different places in the world, not only Europe, but like places like Indonesia and Nigeria. So just 10 years ago, let's say 2007, we came across the re-municipalization of water services, different places in the world. So this is we took as a strategy, to really demonstrate how privatization, this case in water, has been failing very concretely. So then also the privatization project, this is a tool kind of a neoliberal policies. It's very concrete tool like PPP, PFI, whatever they call. So this is a very concrete project to liberalize the something like water, obviously its cons. So, but this project is so ideological. So we had to really say, how to fight against ideological project. We have to show the proof how many places in the world water privatization is not really delivering what they promised. So investment, technology, good services, cheaper cost, nothing, almost nothing is really achieved in so many places. So in a way, this is a kind of a concrete the demonstration. Then people had to fight against, but also fight against for something different solution. So that's the main motivation of this research. That's actually, as a matter of fact, this re-municipalization has become movement. Thanks to the very important, the local development, like recently we call radical municipalism, municipal transformation. So I see the re-municipalization is one of the concrete action or strategies in the municipalism movement. So but again, this the real kind of challenges and experiment in the different places is being so very useful to other places in the world who are fighting against privatization. I'm from Japan. At this right moment, the parliament they passed a law to really open the door much bigger to privatization. So I'm going to after this trip to Japan and Nigeria, and Indonesia, those countries are still the central government are very, very promoting that kind of model. So the world survey, we found more than 800 successful deprivatization cases has happened in the last 15 years. This is something we can concretely challenge. Especially the neoliberal obsession of the policies in different like the country like Japan or Nigeria. So let's move on. The re-municipalization and deprivatization has happened in different ways. So the Bertie and friend also talked about public commons partnerships. Actually, re-municipalization, and at that time we call public partnerships. Those two kind of concrete policies we have really pushed as a mean of the counter proposal to privatization, because we needed to have like something concrete to really improve the capacity of public sector to not only improve capacity but also to reinvent the governance democratic governance, and not only policies but also governance. After all, we are talking about the democratic ownership. So, but this, I think the municipalization is quite useful, one of the useful things, because you fought against privatization, then immediately you have to think about then how to organize new way in locally the public service provision. The last couple of years, there are a lot of bankruptcy of private companies which provide services, like especially waste collections and hospitals. So that happened, for instance, in Norway. The two big companies, waste collection, by the way, those kind of area is after all a monopoly. At least you have 3-4 companies. Telecommunication is the same, waste collection the same. So that's after all, that's a big monopoly, and the competition doesn't really happen after all. So two big companies they collapsed just 1 year ago. So 150 municipalities of Norway just lost provider. But public service has to continue every day. You cannot stop. Even company bankrupt, just withdraw from the city. So at this moment, the 1/3 of the Norway municipalities they have to take over anyway because company is no longer providing services. Then how to organize the waste services? Some municipalities just go to find another private provider through tender, but suddenly many municipalities are really taking as opportunity to rebuild, kind of organize the services in different way with public commitment and re-establish public values. So that's quite difficult because many radical municipalism, the people are preparing to take over their contract. Typically, municipalization is happening at the time the company's contract is expired. This is actually the easiest way to stop the services instead of terminating the contract. So termination of contract is always very conflicted. Sometimes local authority can be sued easily, and even state would be sued nowadays. So that's why this, the phenomenon of the big movement in a way, especially the water in France and the energy in Germany, why they're happening at this moment is this is a time like the 25, 30 years contract are expiring because, that's a neoliberal project began late 1990s, so that makes sense. So that's why this movement will be continuing, we expect to grow, because each local authority really have to think about, especially the time the contract expires. Many people know about Barcelona, so I don't have to say much. But the first time Barcelona and Commune got in power, what they did first thing is to review all services. The city council has how we could call that has made a contract, including the outsourcing. So they had 250 contracts. So actually nobody knows the overview, how much the money local authority paying each different contract, and sometimes contract doesn't exist. So that kind of very ambiguous, unclear situation, they had to really begin from the scratch. So then made a kind of the overview, which services can be outsourced, which services the city has to have full control. So they made a priority to work on. So water and energy are huge priority, of course, because as we all know, the water poverty, energy poverty are big issue in Catalonian cities and Spain and other places. However, those sectors are most difficult too. I don't go into detail. That's the thing. So the Amsterdam, my office is located. the last spring, with a very good surprise, we have got the left green government. Probably ever in the history, Amsterdam is fairly, liberal, neoliberal city last many decades. So they are very, very inspired by the kind of direct democracy, ideas, or also the radical municipalism by Barcelona and other places. So still a long way to go for them, but they kind of committed to have a survey, like to review the city of Amsterdam, how much they outsource, like daycare services. Those, they have a good public service, water, but many services like the care services kindergarten are liberalized tremendously last 10 years. So we're gonna to be kind of help them to study those sectors. Then again, to review what is most important services the city has to have a strong public policies.
I'll stand up, I think. Take my props with me. I thought I'd stand up because of the dreaded post-lunch slump. One of the advantages and disadvantages of talking after the morning session, so much of what was said this morning set alarm bells ringing or set hairs racing in my mind, and there are so many points of connection. And I'd like to thank Martin for arranging this conference, because I do feel that we are a moment of confluence, or of coming together around a whole range of disciplines, a whole range of activities, a whole range of reform projects which have perhaps been fragmented, perhaps been dispirited, but which are now, I think, coming into focus as matters of practical politics, of practical concern. And as I say, a lot of what was said earlier sort of touches on or offers up new avenues of thinking for what I was planning to talk. So if I sound disorganised, it's an honest attempt to engage with the complexity of the subject rather than any personal shortcoming. But you may be able to notice that I seamlessly kind of weave in points of contact from earlier in the day. As Anthony said in this morning's session, we are at a point of major change. If I had enough time, I could talk to you in great authoritative detail about the collapse of the neoliberal project, but we haven't got time, so you have to take that as read. We're also at a moment of regime change in the political economy of media, which is related, but which is running according to its own set of dynamics as well. We're moving from a media regime which is characterised by broadcast plus print, and then a whole set of more peripheral media, book publishing, and so on. We're moving from that broadcast first regime into a digital first regime. And this is, as was the case in the move towards broadcasting in the 1920s, this is leading to a great deal of excessive utopian optimism. In the 20s, there's a lot of talk about the relationship between radio and the university, how radio can be an instrument of general enlightenment. That's fossilised in the BBC's motto of nations shall speak peace unto nation. There's a huge kind of utopian bout of optimism in the 90s and in the early part of this century, which is tied then to the triumph of neoliberalism before 2008. And the idea there is that the simple rolling out of this communications technology will lead to a deepening and a broadening of democracy. That optimism, I think, is in decline, and we're moving now to a much more pessimistic relationship with the media regime. We're hearing the full kind of pharmacopoeia of liberal remedies. We're hearing about informed consumer choices. We're hearing about state regulation. What we're not hearing about, I think, which is something much more marginal, something much more disreputable, which I think is the correct response, which is a properly democratic response to this shift in communications, which is alive to the dangers both of private and of public domination or state domination of the political process. we are at a point, I think, where we can think, touching on what was said earlier about the commons, we are at a point where we can start to think again, I think, about the information space as a commons, something that we collectively author, something on which we all rely, something which can be polluted, something which can be damned and manipulated in ways that we're not aware of if we permit the production of descriptions, the production of information to take place, as it were, out of sight, up the magician's sleeve. So what then would a democratic response to this shift in the media regime look like? What I think it would do to begin with, it would assert the constitutional significance of the communicative order. The communicative order and the constitution are inextricably linked, and to leave the interpretation of communicative rights at the discretion of elected politicians or judges or civil servants is unsafe. It's open in invitation to elite collusion. And I think that the dominant problem we have in the information space is one of elite collusion, particularly collusion between elected politicians and those who dominate the private and state media structures. So firstly, we need to register this as a constitutional shift. It has implications for the structure of the state. And I think key to the understanding this in constitutional terms is to assert a right to communicative equality. The idea being there that every citizen, touching again on Anthony's point about civic republicanism, every citizen, in virtue of being a citizen, has an equal share of voice, or equal stake in, equal purchase on, if you like, production and the reproduction of public speech. So there you have, I think, a clear, explicit principle that should stand with other principles of general equality that we think of. If we want a functioning democracy, we all need to be able to engage as audible, legible, comprehensible agents in the production and reproduction of public speech. Now, obviously, it's complicated by the fact we have a mediated system. We don't live in a city-state of small assemblies. So, however we achieve equality of voice will have to take an institutional turn. Local government is a key part of this for two reasons. The operations of the local state and economy matter in their own right, and they need to be subjected to sustained attention and investigation by an invigilating public. We do have, I can't speak about the devolved nations, but I think in provincial England, it's fair to say we have a major problem of governance in the local tier. Partly this is a matter of over-centralisation, partly it's a matter of missing or defective oversight by media institutions. And the way in which the Conservative government is trying to address that is by pumping subsidies into people like Trinity Mirror and asking them to engage in civic journalism. Essentially the same people who presided over a failure to describe when they were making the vast profits are now being asked to do so on a government subsidy. The other reason, I think, is that the local is where we start to build our sense of what the wide world is like. We talked this morning a bit about the ways in which political action can be a way in which people come into community with one another. And part of what I'm talking about here, I think, is how do we normalise and regularise that revolutionary moment of a sense of agency that takes place in moments like 1917 or 1848. What we think of as exceptional moments, can these be regularised? Can these be institutionalised? Can they be brought in to a stable form of governance? And so my remarks now are slightly preparing recipes for future cooks, but I hope you'll take them in that light as a way of trying to think about how do we, as a matter of embodied persons in space, how do we go about creating a communicative order which is reliable? At the moment, major issues, I think, are subject to a kind of cosmopolitan parochialism. There's a division between the local and national, which, again, touching on what Francis said earlier, is entirely artificial and deceptive. National economies are local economies are national economies. To leave the description of the economy to a directorate in London, which is itself subject to a very particular set of pressures and it generates a certain sort of subjectivity, is a profound mistake. And the result of this, I think, is it tends to naturalise, particularly it naturalises oligarchy both in the economy and in government. So I've only got 2 more minutes, which is good, because I was going to go off on a sort of utopian so you stopped me. But essentially what I would argue is that we need to, as it were, publicise the operations of local government. We need to bring the public into the operations of local government. One way of doing that would be through randomly selected panels, which could sit in oversight of government operations. This implies a different relationship with technocracy. We would have citizens in place with authority engaging with experts and able to exercise democratic judgment in the way that they treat expertise, and to decide ultimately what constitutes expertise. So we move away from technocracy towards the idea of producing democratic reason. Again, to pick up on the point made earlier about a direction of travel, the way you bring the public into the operation of local government sets a template for how you would bring the public into the media institutions. So one way of doing that would be to have regional media co-ops. They'd operate in defined areas. Every resident in that area would have a vote in governance. Every resident in that area would be eligible to serve as a paid jury member on the governance board of those co-ops. And these news co-ops would be engaged as independent actors in the news space, and they would have a huge amount of operational independence. They'd be subject ultimately to community control. But the idea there is that you have an opportunity for the citizenry both as members of juries and as voting individuals, to engage in forms of participation which mean that the contents of public speech are in some ways responsive to their concerns. At the moment, you have to catch the eye of a member of an elite to become newsworthy. It is if you think about it, it is a disgusting system. What we need is a system where citizens, in virtue of being citizens, gather together can say, this is a matter that concerns us. And we will have this made a matter of public business. Now, you think about, I'm not going to go into too much, but you think about the scandals in local government that have been brought to light in the last few years. Imagine a situation where we can come together and say, this is not right. Our fellow citizens are not being protected by the law, and we demand change. Now, that wasn't possible for a generation. And this is because of failings in our media system as much as it was in failings in our public bodies. So we need to have a clearer sense that the media system is part of the Constitution. It must be independent from all kinds of attack from other elements of the Constitution. It must have independent powers. Must have independent rights, but it cannot be left in private hands any longer. The full content of the description on which we rely must have a public character fundamentally. Thank you.
Hi everyone, and thanks to Martin for inviting me to this. My name is Carys, and I have 2 work hats. I work at IPPR part-time, and I also work at Shared Assets part-time. IPPR has been mentioned today, public policy think tank. Shared Assets is a small and think and do tank that looks at land and specifically tries to promote common good land use. And it's land that I want to talk about today. If I can log into my computer. So this is the asset that we don't talk about. Well, we do talk about it, but we don't talk about it anywhere near enough. And I want to make the case that land must be key to new radical municipal strategies, both in terms of delivering a more democratic and more egalitarian local economy, but also in terms of local action to fix a national system that is fundamentally broken. And I'll set out some examples of what that might look like in practice. So I'm sure many of you will be familiar with some of the facts, but I think it's worth repeating them because they're pretty shocking. So in the last two decades, the aggregate market value of land in the UK has quadrupled, increasing recorded wealth by over £4 trillion. House prices have risen 4 times faster than average earnings, and that's, I think about 85% of that comes from land, the rest is a kind of increase in construction costs. We have a heavily financialised model of land as mortgages became more liberalised in the 80s. That's plunged extra demand into house prices, pushing them up, and putting them out of reach of ordinary people, and also causing instability in our economy. And then the other kind of key thing I wanted to talk about, I don't know if anyone read a book by Brett Christopher that came out recently, looking at public land, and in particular the biggest privatisation that we, again, don't talk about. So 10% of land in Britain, or 50% of all public land, has been sold off through piecemeal privatisation since 1979, which is huge, but because it's happened through dribs and drabs, we don't see it on the scale of other privatisations that have happened. So at the moment, our current system has land as an asset and a global store of value for mobile capital. But it doesn't have to be this way. So land is key to solving many of the issues that we share, not as individuals, but collectively. So food production, climate change, biodiversity, economic agglomeration, the right to housing, and these aren't served well by a privatised model. What's more, if we think about kind of the very theory of property, going back to Lockean political theory, this goes to the heart of theories of freedom and self-ownership. But if you're born into a world and into a country in which you can't access land, you don't have that same rights as a citizen. Instead, we have huge inequalities of wealth, which are handed through generations and encouraged by a regressive tax system that actually encourages the system that isn't working very well at all. So that's the depressing think tank analysis. But looking about how we can change it to something that's more positive, I think the key thing to remember is that it hasn't always been like this, and we have had different systems by which we've owned and which we've governed land and access to land. And in particular, the concept of the commons, and thankfully I have the same definition of the commons, so we don't have to go into definition, which I won't repeat. But essentially looking at the resource, who owns it, and then what sets of arrangements and governance we put in place to make sure that we're using that for the many benefits it can bring rather than private profit. So understanding land as a common good. The other thing that I wanted to raise is something that we do at Shared Assets to say housing is really important, but this is about more than housing. We have to look beyond housing in our discourse and also in our analysis of what's going on. This is also about, as I was saying before, well-being, recreation, food, health, and the health of our planet. So what needs to happen? In terms of kind of broadly what we're looking for, I'd say we need to protect the ability of everyone, including future generations, to access and benefit from land. We can't just give it off in a one-shot game and then see how that all falls into place and who benefits in future. We need to stop speculation on land so that it's no longer a financial asset and it's not treated as an asset in a financialised economy, but instead appreciating the use value and sharing the use value of the asset. And we need democratic accountability. And I wanted to bring in an example here of something we're doing at Shared Assets, which is working with the Friends Provident Foundation in the Welsh Valleys, and we're creating a feasibility study of asset transfer of the land surrounding these towns in the Welsh Valleys. And those valleys include Aberfan, where there was the Aberfan disaster. And one thing that really struck me is that going to these communities and saying, actually, you've got public ownership, problem solved, is really not going to address the problem. What's needed is proper community control, people who are close to the issues, close to the land and understand it, and to put control, not just ownership, into their hands. So in terms of concrete strategies, there are a few things that I think it's worth thinking about and reflecting on. And I'm not going to go into huge detail on each, but kind of set out what they are and how this fits into the community wealth building model in particular. So first on that list would be collective ownership. And as I was saying, I think the interesting thing here is public ownership and other forms of collective ownership and often how they interact. So in community ownership in particular, there are community land trusts, which are growing in number. We have the Community Land Trust Network, again for housing but also non-housing. And one of the interesting ideas that is, I've heard discussed in kind of various places, is whether we can apply that model and expand it so it's not just here and there across the economy, but can we take the land out of financial speculation and instead hand it to be governed by people, hand the land to be governed but not the value underlying it, so we can knock out that financialised model. asset transfer. So, for instance, the example in Wales of the public sector transferring assets either permanently or on a long lease, where that's appropriate. So, where there's a community that is able to take on that risk and that challenge, and often they'll need support. So, in the land sector, everyone's normally quite envious of Scotland, and a couple of examples there, which I think are quite demonstrative of the kind of change that can happen, would be the community right to buy, which enables communities to express an interest in a piece of land and say, actually, this is really relevant to what we do, and also apply for financial support from the Scottish Land Fund. Public ownership as well, so one of the issues that we're working with Francis at NEF actually is on sale of county farms. So we have these assets. Has anyone heard of county farms? No, there we go. So I'll explain what they are. They were set up in the 19th century to provide land for new farmers so that they could get a foothold into the farming system. And 50% of them have been sold through privatisation. But could we rethink how they're being used? Could we introduce environmental stewardship into that? Could we introduce education into that? Which brings me on to my next point, which is how can we use public spending better? So land doesn't just produce housing, as I've mentioned. It can be used for wellbeing activities, palliative care. There's all kinds of really interesting examples that link in with other local government policy areas that are really quite interesting and exciting. So I was really interested to hear from Sarah about the hospitals procuring locally grown food, for instance. So those models that we could be following up here. And then the kind of final area that I think we need to look at is how do we recapture public value. So you might have seen this at the kind of land value capture debates. But when Crossrail costs almost £12 billion of investment, it's expected to raise house prices around those stations by £35 billion, and the state isn't going to capture any of that back. How can we change local taxes? How can we change land value capture or recovery mechanisms to get some of that back to the state? There are two challenges I wanted to raise that I think could help inform the discussion, because I think they're common to lots of community wealth building ideas. And one is that kind of democratic tension of our community is actually best placed to do a lot of this stuff. How much do we need to use democratic, representative democracy to control that? We have this system to manage lots of competing interests. Is it effective? How can we make it more effective? And how do those two things go together? I think it's a really knotty issue. And then the other one would be, how do we define communities? So it's very easy to talk about community and say that all this brilliant stuff that's happening in a local area. But there are also communities that aren't geographically based, that might belong to different geographies, and often have very competing expectations of how we use these assets and how we use the land. So in summary, land is the most important asset that we never talk about, that underpins the economy and the society that we see around us. So I would like to see people place it at the heart of the community wealth building ideas that we're discussing, and I think that presents a real opportunity for radical projects.
Stick to time. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. It's been a fascinating day so far, and I'd particularly like to thank Martin, not just for organising it, but for inviting the Centre for Urban Research, Keir, to sort of co-promote this event. I have to be co-director, my other co-director is sitting over there, Martin from the Sociology Department. Thank you very much, and I'm going to probably sort of change the geography a little bit to the Mediterranean, which is where I've done most of my research over the last 3 or 4 years, looking at the migration crisis, and in particular focusing on how the impact of the so-called crisis has changed urban space and urban politics, predominantly in southern Italy, but also in Greece. And if I have time, I'll say a little bit about these, but I've only got 10 minutes, so I may have to save that for questions if anyone has. But what I wanted to start with really was an example of a town which I imagine many of you already heard of in the news. A tiny little village, basically, right on the instep of Italy and Calabria, known as Riace. Has everyone heard of Riace, or quite a few of you? Some recognition, yeah. And particularly the role played by its mayor, Domenico Lucano. The reason why I'm choosing this is because it's illustrative of a wider argument that I want to make about how the failure of the national state and the failure particularly of EU institutions, as well as international humanitarian organisations, has created a vacuum, if you like, at the heart of one of the largest post-war emergencies that Europe has faced. And the consequence of that has been to effectively reconstitute the municipal and the local in ways which I think are beginning to show us, at least in material terms, what Henri Lefebvre's famous excoriation about 50 years ago of the droit à la ville, the right to the city, what it actually means in practice, how we can constitute this in practice. Largely, I want to say, but not entirely, but certainly largely in the absence of the national state. I'll talk a bit about the role of the local states. So this small fishing village then on the Calabrian coast has been home to, over the course of about 20 years, some 6,000 refugees. Its normal population is about 1,500. And it became this kind of internationally recognised experiment, if you like, in a kind of solidaristic international community living, largely by accident. It was back in July 1998 that a ship was wrecked on the coast of Calabria, near to the town. On board were 218 Kurds. They planned to head for the Greek coast, but the ship that they were being effectively trafficked on ran aground. Whoever was behind it sort of managed to escape, and these poor people were stuck on the rocks, many nearly dead from hypothermia. And it was actually local residents who came. It's literally like a Hollywood movie. I mean, if you were sort of reconstructing this story, you could imagine who'd be playing the various characters. And in a way, I mean, sort of, it's probably not an inappropriate metaphor, because in a way, sort of, Lucano, as a young man, sort of got together with friends, and they said, we've got to do something. It's not good enough just to rescue these people. We've got to find them somewhere to live. We've got to find them some way of remaking their lives here. And so they set up an organisation called Città Futura, the Future City. My colleague Jonathan Davis mentioned Gramsci earlier. So that you will see stitched into this narrative references to Gramsci as well, because these were an idealistic bunch of young people, most of them were unemployed themselves, who saw the possibility of literally rebuilding the new city with those who had effectively been forced to flee from the conflicts of the Middle East, conflicts of Africa, from starvation, from poverty. It was an opportunity to literally rebuild a new society. And what they were actually trying to do was to build a practical utopia. In this part of Italy, which had been overrun by the mafia, Dragons to be precise, and in which most of the population had been forced into exile because of lack of opportunities, lack of employment opportunities and so on. It was a dying city, which incredibly enough was being revived by the arrival of these refugees from Eritrea, from Syria, from Iraq, from Kurdistan, and so on and so forth. And what they were able to do effectively was to use the resources of the state through a program of refugee resettlement known as the SPRA. I won't give you the Italian were basically their second stage reception centres, essentially, which sprung up all over Italy, financed through the local authority, and the local authority gets its funding from the Interior Ministry. And that's where we come to the less happy part of the story, but I'll return to this, because the SPRA system has many good examples, and Riace was one of them. There are others in Sicily that I visited and researched that are equally excellent. But of course there are a number which have fallen victim to organised crime themselves. And part of the reason why this experiment, this 20-year experiment, was recently effectively shut down by the new Minister of the Interior, a man called Matteo Salvini, who's the head of the Northern League. At this point, it's fine to boo and hiss. It's not quite the end of pantomime season yet. The reason why this particular good example of a SPRA was shut down was precisely because the previous administration had been, well, let's put it this way, I don't risk any libel. See, there had been a sort of rather cosy, shall we say, relationship between elements of organised crime and these different so-called co-ops which manage these asylum reception centres very lucratively, it should be said. In other words, organised crime in southern Italy has been extremely interested in this kind of market, and they are extremely concerned to stop progressive characters like Lucano and other more progressive co-ops from having access to these funds. And so it's no surprise and no coincidence that this new government, which came to power following elections last March, has, of course, sought to stamp out these good examples. But it's worth pointing out, actually, that internationally this has been a kind of a poster sort of example of how to do integration and resettlement in a way which actually allows for local communities that are suffering from decline, suffering from loss of population, suffering from a kind of a lack of economic opportunities. Basically, the UNHCR and other organisations, including the EU, were very keen to support and fund these initiatives. So in a sense, Salvini's and his henchmen's decision to arrest and put under house arrest the mayor of Riace with allegations of effectively facilitating illegal migration, which is a very serious charge, and for organising fake weddings, charges which have subsequently got nowhere. But you can see what the political intent was. The political intent was to kill this experiment in radical local democracy and radical solidarity. However, it's backfired, because fairly soon after, around Italy, demonstrations took place in virtually every city in Italy. Major cities, Milan, Turin, Naples, Palermo, all said, Lucano, you're welcome here. We will take your population. Because the other really sad aspect of it is all of the local refugees were basically evicted from their town, from their homes. They were told to go, effectively. Now, I mean, I could make parallels with what happened in the 1920s and 1930s, but I will leave you to make those associations yourself. Effectively, Lucano was forced into internal exile. Okay, so I know I'm almost running out of time, but I just wanted to sort of finish by saying that why I think the Riace experiment is important for thinking about the subject of today's conference is really that if you look what's happened very, very recent days, for example in Palermo, Orlando, who I know reasonably well, has refused to implement the new security law of Salvini. And he has said effectively, we will not stop asylum seekers from registering with the registry office so that they can get their documents to have access to health, education, etc., etc. We will not allow our population to be made illegal. come and arrest us if you want. And in fact, that's exactly what Salvini sent the kind of, effectively, the special branch, the DDoS, into, literally this last 40 hours, into the registration centres to try and get hold of the rolls to find out who has been registered, who might be undocumented. This is a real constitutional live crisis happening right now, and it's being fought at the municipal level by progressive mayors. The mayor of Naples has said, Sea-Watch 3, sail your ship as close as you can to the Bay of Naples. We will send out little ships to pick up the refugees and bring them to shore, Dunkirk style. I said this is a bit like a Hollywood movie, I'm not joking this. It's dramatic stuff which is happening at the moment, and it's happening because, I would argue, there is a fundamental breach between the national state, which is increasingly moving in an anti-democratic, post-fascist direction, let's be frank, and the local state, which is standing up for the values of the Italian constitution. And fascinatingly enough, the President of the Republic, Sergio Mattarella, happens to be a friend of Orlando, in a very coded Christmas speech, basically nodded and winked and sort of like said, all power to you, effectively. The Constitution defends what you're doing. So this is a very interesting moment, because it's actually this particular conflict which I think is going to show the way for not just radical politics, but basically the liberal constitutional state which is under threat in Europe right now. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we've only got time for maybe one round of questions, so maybe I can take 3 questions and then we'll have some very brief responses from the panelists. So lots on the table, from the new institutionalism to remunicipalization, media and democracy and the constitution, land, migration and solidarity. So who's got questions? In there? We'll start with your question.
Yeah, Leicester Martin. I have a background in planning and economic development, so I was really pleased that the subject of land came up. But the question I have, and Carys, you were talking about the situation in Scotland, and you're right, you do have a Scottish Land Commission, and actually there's a new experiment just beginning too, which will allow councils the right to force the sale of vacant and derelict land, which has been lying there with nothing happening on it and nobody knowing who the owner is for decades. Put into productive use. So there are good things happening, but the question I have, and it's really for Keir and Bertie as well, I guess, because when you both talked about that ownership wasn't the only part of it, you needed governance. And as a planner as well, I know how difficult it is, the concept of community, which all sounds nice and cosy, but of course it's anything but. And a lot of these processes are quite divisive for communities. And in fact, what's happened so far in Scotland is that the take-up of the right to buy land has been very slow. And I think part of the reason for that is because there's a cultural shift needed. You know, a lot of communities think this isn't for them, this isn't something they want to do. They don't know the full reasons. It's a research agenda in itself to find out what's going on. So I really just wondered, any reflections on that, the sort of the governance part of it as well. And who has the legitimacy to form these groups and to buy and manage land in the right way? Because I've seen many bad examples as well as good examples of where communities start to take control of their assets.
Thank you. Take another couple of questions if there are any. No? People in food coma still? All right, well then why don't we just have a last round of comments, responses to that in just a couple of minutes. Is that up?
Yes. Well, I'm just thinking what would be the using this the precious time to share with you. So I don't really work on land. So let me just say, because I got really touched by the Simon's last contribution, what's really happening now, especially in Naples, Palermo, and the 3 cities. I think Firenze. They really declared strongly to support refugees. So Naples, as you may know, Naples is one of the leading cities of radical municipalism. We just the last month, TNI, Corporate Europe Observatory, and Barcelona and Commune had a debate in European Parliament. how radical municipal policies can be blocked by European Union particularly. But European Union's policies, I don't say much about that. This is about austerity, this is about public procurement rules, and also state aid, and also trade and investment agreement. Mainly those four things are really blocking, the effectively radical municipal strategies. So, the European Union is in a way a little bit less relevant here, but the member states of European Union are often kind of over implementing EU policies more than necessary, especially in the context of far right or really right wing government. That's something we are the situation many countries are facing. So one of the interesting the kind of perspective that the debate was the Barcelona in commune with NATO, particularly Grenoble, Amsterdam together, Paris together. They kind of prepared municipalize Europe, the kind of 20 principal visions of particularly for the European Parliament election. So this is not only election, but how European Union looks like if you are based in radical municipalism. So they have 20 principles like non-speculation in the land. They protect people from renters and living people from the extreme tourism, for instance. Stop lobbying. Those very important things we are talking about. So they set as a principle to unite to fight in the European Parliament election. So that indicates, we talked about localism and local radical democracies, but this is always really well linked. They're linked with internationalism as well. So this is something really new. So Martin said about local protectionism, and so that's something we need to make our new narrative. To the municipalism, radical municipalism is an opportunity to make international solidarity and cooperation.
I'm glad you brought up compulsory sales orders because that was on my list, but Joe handed me a scary 2 minute sign. I also think it's important that we don't fetishise Scotland. It can look very, we're envious of it over the border, but obviously there are huge challenges. It's also a very different landscape. It's not more private ownership being shifted into community ownership, whereas the landscape down here is quite different. In terms of how we increase take-up of those sorts of things, I think there's a big role for support, so organisations like Locality, but also democratic institutions and local government themselves. So the example that I mentioned in Wales, one thing we've been doing there, the community there weren't looking for this. We've gone to them and said, hey, do you want to work with us to think about it? And what we've done is engaged a local artist to do a kind of imagining stage to try and open up the thoughts about what could possibly happen in that area, and then mix that with kind of support on the feasibility study and particularly economic expertise, because there's no reason community groups should have the expertise that they need to take on these sorts of things. So I think there's a big support role, and also it comes back to that relationship between local government. We have those democratic structures and processes happening to make sure that we overcome those divisions, or at least have a space to discuss them. But there certainly is a challenge to the sector to work out how we make sure it's not just the sharp-elbowed middle classes that manage to make use of this legislation, but a much broader set of people.
I'm going to say it's about the media, obviously. Where I live, we've seen large amounts of public money going into the acquisition of assets which have then effectively been privatised. And this has taken place in conditions where really no one really understands the issues, no one really understands the ways in which governance was subverted, and essentially, as I say, a process of illicit privatisation took place. And I think perhaps I'll preempt what the gentleman at the end will talk about, but I think what's needed is an understanding, a much broader understanding of the way in which property and land feeds into the creation of common pool resources in the jargon. That you create things which then generate revenues over time. And we don't do this in a kind of wishy-washy, wouldn't that be nice way, but there's a way for communities or way for populations, bluntly, to get richer and to get wealthier on an egalitarian basis. So the privatisation model we have at the moment takes land away from the public sector, privatises it, and it captures rents effectively. And this rentier model of development we have is pervasive. And it's pervasive partly because people do not understand it. And they think the private sector will come in and make things okay, when in fact they won't. That's just not what the private sector is for. And a common pool approach to these assets, it seems to me, if it's broadly understood, will help incentivise communities, again, not in a wishy-washy way, but to form cooperatives that seek to create a good living for their members, to manage these assets and to do so in a way that's accountable to the broader public. And there's a whole set of issues around how you do that. But I agree wholeheartedly, community is a word that covers a multitude of sins. We need to be much more hard-headed about the institutional forms that we create, which circulate information and circulate power in such a way that property that could be used for the common good is used for the common good.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. To sort of echo what you're saying about the potential for some of these Europe-wide city networks. And I mean, Eurocities, I sort of studied them 15 years ago. There was quite a moribund organisation then, sort of trying to push technical fixes and smart cities and stuff like that. It's actually now become a lot more interesting as a result of the migration crisis, and that it now has a sort of a sub-network called Solidarity Cities, which are actually sharing best practice around integration, around anti-racism, around how we can assist new residents into training and jobs and education and things like that, which is an important initiative, I think, in the context, as I said, of this far-right drift at the national level. And we can criticise the EU in terms of its border policies, but actually, ironically, it's the kind of right left hand of the state, isn't it, as Borgia talks about. I mean, there is a hand of the European state which actually can be somewhat benign, and we need to sort of support and encourage that, I think, at least for no other reason than because people need help in the situation.
Yes, so you had a couple of different questions, and I'm not going to address both of them. But the problem of the take-up, who takes up participation in these, and how do you increase participation? Obviously I haven't got an answer, but that's behind our approach to this is the idea that there are material and subjective preconditions to democratic participation. Right? Material preconditions most obviously is time. Right? It's a real difficult one when you've got the working day expanding. The subjective conditions are, experience of engaging with and thinking about these sorts of problems that become easier to do. So that's why we want to think of this as a sort of an iterative process that rolls out as experience spreads, and also as you get, national government action and other types of action to deal with the bigger material issues. So it's an iterative process, but why I would say why we would want to prioritise the commons in that iterative process is because the commons is not just a form of ownership; it's a form of governance. The two are absolutely linked. So if the commons is going to persist, it needs a community of commoners to do the active process of commoning, right? Which is not just the democratic governance, deciding the model of governance of the commons. It's also participating in the commons in line with the decisions of that. That's the active act of commoning, and so we think of that as a training in democracy in various ways. It doesn't answer your question, but it sort of touches on it just close enough.
The only thing I'd add was maybe a little anecdote to build on that, on this point of democracy, which I gave a lecture in Leeds a few weeks ago, and I asked all the students to organise themselves into 3 groups, and I said, I don't mind how you do it, but please do it. And then I waited, and nobody moved. And I thought this is the most basic lesson on democracy you could possibly have, which is how do you collectively arrange I don't care how you make the decision about being in these 3 groups, but how are you going to do this together? And it sounds maybe a little bit simplistic or trite, but for me I was actually quite worried about the inability of a group of 21-year-olds to organise into 3 groups. Because if you can't do that, we might as well all go home. There's no hope, if that's our limit. But I think it brings us back to this point of the language we use in the actual article is commoning a lot more than commons. It's the act of doing together. And then I think maybe one of the challenges we really face is precisely that this training in democracy is like we really are starting, to get out of this interregnum, to move forward. We have to start doing that together. And this private-public binary is a real problem. Either we look out for ourselves or we expect the state to do it for us. Well, neither of those really speak to this collective idea of how would we negotiate. As you're saying, conflicts will always occur. We'll never get rid of them. It's our ability to collectively negotiate and do these together, understanding our common good and so on, which really counts in that. So, maybe starting with the kids. Start with kids.
Just one small comment back on all
Very
this.
quick.
Very quick. And all this is that for many years we've had a thing called Planning Aid, which helps communities understand. It's a volunteer network across, and it seems to me surely this is a model that could be expanded, not just to help people understand the planning system, but to help people understand the economy, to help people understand how you buy land, many things which communities need help to understand, to give them the tools. Local government are going to do it, but as a service, it just ain't going to happen. But there's a huge growth in all kinds of business, corporate responsibility, whatever you want to call it, skills-based volunteering. There is a model here that is going to be picked up, I think, and it's something I think perhaps the RSA can do.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking all the panellists.